Who's the other people?
Yeah, they're here. If the, I got their names, but it's okay. I'm gonna close this down a little bit because it takes up a lot of room. All right. Well, first of all, I don't have all of your quiz 4 submissions yet. Any questions about that before we get into
Me?
the
I
artwork?
have the question.
What is the question, dear?
What to do to cross the road?
To get to the other side?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that chicken always gets me.
Hmm.
Well, no questions. I
I actually do have a question about the
Oh yeah,
quiz.
Mia.
So, uh, is it just supposed to be like in a timeline format, kind of?
A timeline format, exactly.
Okay.
And what I want you to do is pick out, the 4 degrees, you know, the 4 stages, the 4 artworks or artists you're connecting, and secondly, um, a little bit of explanation on how they tie together.
Okay.
So yeah, you're on it.
Papa,
hmm
what's the other people name?
Well, there's a bunch of people. I can show you
You know how I work the computer?
a little bit. So I got Mia, who I was just talking to, Melissa, Robin, Olivia, Amanda,
Why you have lots of people students?
Hamid, Sierra, Jacob, Isabel.
What's the other guy name? That was so funny.
Yeah, that was everybody. So let's get it started. And so finally, after all this time, we're going to take an extensive look at the United States and Mexico, and it follows a different trajectory. I want to kind of explain
I know
what
what it is.
what is it, baby?
A girl, an old lady carrying a bucket.
Yes, an old lady carrying a bucket, and some other people. They're kind of dressed up, and so this was what was going on in the United States at the turn of the century. And this guy's name is John Sloan. And there were a number of painters in the New York area, and they were kind of doing the same sort of thing. If you want to take a look at it and analyze it vis-a-vis European painting, first of all, you can see it's kind of got that impressionistic brushwork. It's not trying to be a photograph. It is a painting. And what we have here is everyday scenes from New York. And so there were a group of these guys. They called themselves the Eight, because there was 8 painters kind of associated with doing this everyday thing. And if you could, excuse me, pull this to think about realism, the Stonebreakers, Third Class Carriage, uh, Courbet, Damier, Millet, the Gleaners. It's kind of everyday people doing everyday things. Some of these guys were derided by the critics. They call it the ash can school. And the reason they called them that was that they thought that these artists were going to the what would be the dumpster to look for their subject matter. But they were realist, and that was kind of the avant-garde in New York at the turn of the century.
I know what that is.
What is this?
Class?
Well, it is. this is called Nude Descending a Staircase, and it's by Marcel Duchamp. And he's the guy that did the urinal. He's the guy that did the Mona Lisa with the mustache and goatee. And this is 1912, and this is before he got into Dada and all of that other stuff. Dada, you like that? It is funny. And so, what this is, Marcel Duchamp was somebody who was kind of actually very much aware of what was going on in Europe. And this is, and by his own explanation, this is somewhat of a cubist painting. And you see the subject matter is fractured and put back together, kind of like cubism. And he talked about futurism because he's showing in this painting movement. She is descending down a staircase, and that little these little loops, that's it. That's the movement. Yeah, it's sort of like her arms swing and was she walking down the stairs. And so there's some of these other lines like this, like that, designed to show movement. But Duchamp was and stayed during his entire life. He was uh, very much in touch with New York art. And I got to say this, I have a picture of this somewhere. Before the World Trade Center was attacked 20 years ago, I went up in the World Trade Center just a couple of months before it was destroyed. And on the top floor, they had a place where you could uh, basically see the rest of New York City. It was kind of a viewing area. And on the interior, they had kind of a history of New York, a history of New York, and talking about basically a display of all of the famous people from New York. And Marcel Duchamp was on that. I was so amazed. But at any rate, Duchamp went back and forth across the Atlantic, and he actually helped some of these art collectors pick out some of those great paintings from France and Europe, but primarily from France. Helped them pick out all of these great artworks because we had a lot of money. There were people wanting to buy this up. I talked to you about that before. Why is it that the US has all of those great examples of Van Goghs and Seurat and Matisse and so on? Why do we have all of those Monet water lilies? Because people like Duchamp, who actually knew about the art, kind of worked as a consultant to the people that actually had the money to purchase this stuff. So anyway, there's Marcel Duchamp, but along with helping acquire that work, he was actually bringing his influence to the artist of New York at that time. And so he was kind of a conduit for not only artwork, but for a lot of art ideas. And so what we have here, what is this?
A painting.
It is a painting. And you see that he's got, oh, I can't hold it there, but he's got a signature on it. His name is Arthur Dove. And it's nature symbolized. And basically, it's right out of Cubist work. And it's nature symbolized. And so we see these abstract landscapes starting to come out of New York. And so, kind of behind the times, but there was, I got to add to this.
I know what that is.
What is that?
A painting.
It is a painting. You're good. what we have here is that this guy here, Alfred Stieglitz, the Alfred Stieglitz collection, he was a guy that was actually bringing a lot of those European ideas to New York as well.
Was he? Oh, that's a waste.
hmm And he did this thing. He staged in 1913 something that's known in art history as the Armory Show, and he brought a lot of European art for this big art exhibit extravaganza, and he actually had put a lot of American artists into the mix. And so I want to tell you a little story about this because uh, this painting was included in the Armory Show of 1913. And ex President Theodore Roosevelt went to see this
Painting.
painting, all of the paintings. And he called this is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. He said he thought this painting looked like an explosion in a shingle factory. A little bit of history, a little bit of trivia. But see, that's indicative of sort of the uphill battle that a lot of these artists were facing because America wasn't really buying into abstraction, not the way that it had been practiced in Europe with Cubism and so on. But here's another American, and it's a portrait of a German officer. And it's basically a design. It's got a lot of symbols, a lot of military colors, a lot of military shapes, flag, obviously the German Iron Cross, and so on. So artists were doing,
I know what it is.
what is it, baby?
Is a fish in a painting?
It is a painting.
I know it.
Yeah. And so this is Stuart Davis. Hot, still, Skate for Six Colors, and Seventh Avenue style. Here's a guy that kind of follows after the artist we've just seen, and he really embraces Cubism in a big way. And he kind of combines two things. He has Cubism, synthetic Cubism, as part of his inspiration, if you will. And the other part is jazz music. And he talked about composing these works in syncopated rhythm, which is a term which is one of the foundational aspects or tenets of American jazz music. And so we have this. Now, it was and is now, uh, he is considered a great American painter, to be sure, but there were still people not quite ready for this kind of abstraction. And a lot of people called this stuff like colonial cubism. Now that says something there if you think about it, because there was an aversion, a widespread aversion against anything European, their art, their wars, their culture. There was this kind of independence that Americans prided themselves in, and they didn't really see Cubism or modernism as something that we should be doing over here. Of course, what we're seeing is that not everybody believed that. And to the idea of colonial cubism, actually, this guy, Stuart Davis, great American painter, he created a painting called Colonial Cubism. And you can look that up. It's kind of easy to find, it's pretty famous. And so all of these people have their own stories. We're just kind of running through these. Um, Charles Demuth actually had some connection to the Stieglitz Gallery uh, and the artist of 291, which is their group, their publication. Anyway, Charles Demuth, My Egypt. And it's kind of like Cubism. It's kind of like Orphic Cubism in a way, where he draws these lines and fractures the light. Orphic Cubism, Robert Delaunay, they were really into breaking up not only the physical objects, but kind of cutting through the light and fracturing that and putting it back together. So that's what these lines and these colors represent is
I know what it is.
what is it?
It's a house, and is that the moon?
No, it's not the moon, but you're right. It kind of looks like a house. Actually, it's a factory. And one of the things that these guys, Charles Demuth and Charles Sheeler, who was a contemporary, um, and Ralston Crawford, another one, uh, they were called precisionists. And it was a group of artists who painted in this way, and they used very clean, straight lines. They used some cubist, what we would call cubist devices in terms of like these things of breaking up the light. But what they had in common is that they made artwork about industry. They made artwork about all of these factories and all of these uh, smelting uh, factories and all of this manufacturing and all of this stuff that actually was ending up in reality polluting. They cleaned it up and they would present this in very clean, very sanitized images. Okay, what are you talking about, baby?
Okay, so is that where you get the painting from?
Yeah. And see, to make my point about the pollution, here is the smokestack and here is the smoke. But it's not like really affecting anything, and there's no soot on the silos here or on the walls or anything. It's basically clean. And they did a lot of stuff like that. And favorite subjects were things like the Dearborn plant, the Ford Dearborn plant in Detroit, Michigan, which was a large manufacturing plant where they made Model Ts and other Fords after that. Um, so anyway, yeah, the precisionist had a kind of um, a very what you might say, sanitized or a fantasy about industry. And so among those two in New York at the time, Georgia O'Keeffe, and she married Alfred Stieglitz, the guy who was promoting all of this modernism in New York, bringing European ideas to the artist. And O'Keeffe was right there, right in the middle of them. And this is New York Night, 1929. It's basically pretty flat, and it's kind of a pattern of all of the lights. What's this over here, sweetheart?
A city.
A city. That is correct.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so uh, O'Keeffe will go on, and she'll in the early 1930s will move out to Taos, New Mexico, start an artist colony, and give up these cityscapes in favor of doing up close versions of flowers and plants. And that would go back to, if I could run this backwards, I don't think it's that far back. This kind of is like Georgia O'Keeffe,
I know
but this is a little bit more painterly, but
it. Is it
O'Keeffe,
a monkey?
no,
Oh, that was a
I'm the
monkey.
only monkey around here. All right. So, uh, that's what she's famous for. Oddly, that's not in the textbook. But she does these up close version, beautiful paintings of flowers and cacti and and dried cow skulls and things that she'd find there in the New Mexico desert. Oh, and by the way,
I know what that is.
yeah, I'm gonna I'm just gonna say that George O'Keeffe lived to be like 101 years old. He really outlived almost everybody here.
This is a city with people and the place to eat.
That is correct. This is the city, and these are the people, and this is a place to eat. It's called Nighthawks, and this is one of the most famous paintings of American art. And so you want to know where all of this famous American art comes from. It comes from this time pre World War II, and out of uh, out of this environment. Now, Nighthawks here is one of the most famous American paintings ever. But what Hopper does, and this is kind of a through line of his work, is that he basically paints people in a city environment, lonely people in a city environment. And so you see, this part of town, they rolled up the sidewalks. Everybody's asleep, and it's just these four people awake. They're Nighthawks, and these two may have, if you would read into the story, they may have been out to see a play, or they had been dancing or something, nightclub. And here's another guy who's lonely by himself. And this is a little island of humanity in this part of town that's dormant, going to sleep. And so Hopper almost always portrays these lonely people. And so um, what we get into, and I just had O'Keeffe on there, what we're starting to see here, we'll see a trend towards painting Americana. And so life was changing in 1942. The idea of having uh, all night diner was still kind of a new and different thing. We didn't do 24/7 back in the 40s and before that. We were still primarily operating on some of the habits and behaviors from rural America when we were an agrarian culture and people worked in the day and they slept at night. Yada, yada, yada. Life has changed. There were no 7-Elevens, and were there wasn't anything like that. All night Jack in the Box drive through didn't happen. In fact, even driving was still kind of a rarity. But anyway, I brought some other examples of spoofs, spin-offs of this painting because I was knocking around and just thinking about all of the different versions that people have kind of, all of the memes that this painting has inspired. For instance, The Simpsons. Oh,
I
Here we are.
I know those guys I watching from the movie.
Yeah, from The Simpsons.
Yeah, I see him.
Yummy
Crap.
donuts, not, Philly's 5 cents. Yeah, donuts. Yeah, see, I mean, just anyway, The Simpsons, Nintendo. Put all these Nintendo, the Mario Brothers, and Super Mario, run his go kart, yada yada yada. Anyway, you know, anybody know what this Phillies is about? It was 5 cents. It was a very popular cigar, and people smoked cigars much more than you see today. Of course, a lot of people smoke cigarettes as well. Um, Jim's Diner. Whoa, Big Bird, Bert, Ernie, Kermit means Jim Henson's, I'm sure. And so, anyway, Aaron Douglas, Noah's Ark, African American artist, and you see, he's doing some of the same things that we saw in Charles Demuth. The idea of fracturing the light, and this is even more, a little bit more like Orphic cubism in the way that the circles are put together too. Of course, it's basically a monochromatic painting. That would say that it's basically purple. Aaron Douglas, Noah's Ark, he was an African American artist and painted his subjects based on his experience as an African American. Fisk University Galleries. Fisk University was a traditional African American university. That's where this is today, but you can see for a lot of people kind of accepting and playing around with and operating using some of the ideas generated in Europe. And I got another Aaron Douglas too. Uh, he does a lot of work, and we got some of the fracturing of the light here. Excuse me, but from slavery through Reconstruction, from aspects of Negro life, and at the time, I know this comes up a lot, Negro. At the time, that was a polite term. We don't use that word anymore. We use blacks or African Americans. But and I want to point out the kind of flatness you see. Flatness is something that comes out of Cubism as well, and Douglas does that. You still see what's going on here, but bottom line, it's flat. And another guy, I put a star by him, Jacob Lawrence, and he was very prolific, and he made tons of paintings about the conditions under which African Americans were living, and the migration of the Negro, 1940, 1941. He did a whole bunch of paintings about the Great Migration. And the Great Migration was basically a lot of African Americans were finding it intolerable to continue living in the South. And many saved up their money, got on a train, and came up to the industrial North, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, and so on. And like like migrants of from all ages. They were looking for a better life for themselves and their children. And what you had in the North was a burgeoning industry, industrial revolution, if you will. We in North, you could go work in a steel mill or car manufacturing plant or a lot of things going on. There was employment, good wages. But the other part of that was putting up this barrier because in a lot of places, racial segregation was still practiced, and this was a terrible time for this country. Um, and I just saw last week a special on or a story on um, the riots in the 1970s in Boston that erupted from their attempt to desegregate schools. And so, anyway, it's a modern problem. It's the African American experience. And here is one of their greatest voices, Jacob Lawrence. I got something else here, too, because Jacob Lawrence showed up in the news just a few weeks ago. And it says Metropolitan Museum celebrated exhibition, Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. See what I'm telling you? Has drawn many visitors, but one of them had a revelation. She suspected that one of the 5 panels missing from the artist's original series of 30, re-examining the nation's early history, had been hanging in her neighbor's Upper West Side apartment for decades. So she returned home, encouraged them to contact the museum. The neighbors had purchased a small painting by the renowned black artist for a very modest sum at a friend's Christmas charity auction in 1960 to benefit a music school. They are an elderly couple and asked the Met and the New York Times that they not be identified to protect their privacy. They are not art collectors. They'd only became aware that their painting of confrontation between soldiers and farmers in the Revolutionary War times might possibly be part of a larger series when they read stories about the Lawrence exhibition premiering earlier this year at the Peabody Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. And the curator's efforts to locate the lost works. Last week, the couple finally contacted an art advisor to help them navigate the Met, one of the country's largest museums. So basically, what they did was give it back. But a lot of things get lost in history, and this, like I say, was in the this was in somebody's apartment, and they had it for 50, 60 years. And so, anyway, here it is. And it's titled, There Are Combustibles in Every State, which a spark might set fire to. Washington 26 to December 1786, panel 16. And it was done in 1956. And so, yeah, this is farmers and soldiers fighting it out. Anyway, just say it. Great African American painter. And so that kind of gets us here. Americana, back on the front burner. This is one of the most famous paintings ever of American art, especially 20th century American art. Grant Wood, American Gothic, and like Nighthawks, it's at the Chicago Art Institute. And it's a farmer. And there's his farm, and he's got a pitchfork. He's got a jacket on. He's got bib overalls on, and it's a picture of a hard-working Iowa farmer. As a matter of fact, you can go to Eldon, Iowa. It's not too far off north of the Missouri-Iowa border, and this house still stands, and it's kind of a tourist attraction, and you can get your picture taken in front of the house, just like Grant Wood painted this couple. And so this is Americana and Grant Wood, and these guys were called regionalist because they really weren't into all of that European stuff. Affected them not in the least. And so Grant Wood, this is a kind of interesting story. He was kind of a left-leaning artist politically, and he did a lot of art that kind of tended to be a little more critical of the government, and especially Herbert Hoover, who was president in 1930 and who was from Iowa. And so he made paintings about that and about other bits of America. But this was considered regionalism because these were generated in Iowa. He was from Iowa. The scope of the artwork and his frame of reference is the Midwest. And another guy who was from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton, early days and early settlers, fresco in the state capital, Jefferson City, Missouri. And so what Thomas Hart Benton did, and there's one of these murals at the old post office actually in St. Louis, and you can find these at various places in the state. What Thomas Hart Benton did, he was more a right leaning artist of his time. And a lot of what he painted gave a kind of painted a false narrative of what life was like, early pioneer days and early settlers, you know. And so you see this guy here with the liquor, and he's giving the Native Americans some alcohol, trading it for a pelt, if you will. You know, it's all kinds of stuff. Not was designed to be flattering. It was designed to kind of celebrate the American nation, but we kind of look at it a little differently these days. I want to tell you a little bit about murals. What happens in the 1930s? This is 1936. We see a lot of artists getting commissions and painting murals in public places. And so this being about the early settlers and quote American history, you know, and different kinds of things. What we see here is kind of interesting too. We see a raft and a steamboat, you know, and kind of think about Mark Twain, I would guess, that way. And I'm not sure what this exactly is. It looks like this may be slave trading here. These guys standing around and this guy selling this human being. Bottom line, the murals were painted in oftentimes to promote a particular political point of view. And in Jefferson City, this was kind of the history that they endorsed. And so murals were painted for a couple of reasons. One is it's kind of propaganda to some extent, but the other is that this was a depression. And one of the things that the government was doing at the time was helping commission artists, paying artists to put murals in public buildings. And so a lot of the artists of the time, this is probably the most celebrated of all of them, a lot of the artists of the time got made their living as muralists for what was called the WPA, the Works Project Association or agency, I forget which. Anyway, government actually helped pay for artists to put paintings in public places. And so here we go, another mural. Epic of American Civilization, Hispano America, panel 16, fresco in the Baker Memorial Library, Dartmouth College. Fresco, mural, 1932, 1934. And so this is Hispano America, those from Spanish descent. And you see, you got all kinds of things here. You see all this gold. In some respects, that's one of the things that drew a lot of Europeans to the New World was gold. And especially in the Spanish speaking countries, they just tons and tons of gold exported, brought back to Europe. And you see greedy bankers and stuff, military people, old civilizations crumbling, military junta guy with a knife going to stab this regular guy. I mean, he's got a bandolier of ammunition and stuff, but basically, your average guy getting stabbed in the back, and then you see all of these other masked characters and stuff. So, anyway, you can see, like I was saying, there's typically a political bent on what's being depicted. Thomas Hart Benton, Jose Clemente Orozco, and this guy, Diego Rivera. And this is a fresco, it's in Mexico City. And this is the history of Mexico again. And so Diego was really kind of an interesting character. And he has, you know, the native people, he has a lot of other um, things going on, Aztec heritage and so on. Again, it's a version of history. Now, Diego himself personally was a communist. You can't get more left leaning, I think, than being a communist. And he was commissioned to paint murals in the US too, not just in Mexico, and stirred up quite a controversy when he was commissioned to paint a mural in the Rockefeller building, Rockefeller Center, there, New York, and paid for and erected by Rockefellers, who were the prime capitalists. And here we have this communist doing the mural, and it caused some stir. He basically he weathered the storm. In fact, they were so much into communism. There was a guy named Leon Trotsky who was the deputy to Vladimir Lenin, who pretty much engineered the October Revolution and brought in uh, the Soviet state. He was exiled in the 1930s and he stayed with Diego and his wife, uh, her, Frida Kahlo. Diego and Frida were married and they were both artists, and she wasn't quite as well known at the time, but she did a lot of work and she's really famous today. I mean, it took the world some time to catch up to the genius, but she did a lot, almost all of her work is autobiographical. And the two Fridas, what she's talking about here is that she had a lot of health problems stemming from a terrible bus accident that she was involved in, and it required numerous surgeries throughout her life because it had broken her back. And so this is about a blood transfusion, and it's about the bride, the wife of a famous artist. And here is the other, the the real Frida, and you see they're sharing the same blood. I want to back up a little bit because see, uh, this is kind of a thing. It's like a lot of the women who are making art at the time do artwork that connects them to the earth and says friend of the birds, and that's really what this is about. Frida has a lot of work, autobiographical, and her connection to nature. And in fact, you'll see a lot of Frida Kahlo paintings uh, that have animals and flora, jungle, etc. And so, anyway, this is kind of an interesting relationship. Diego, the political guy that's kind of the rock star, and Frida, who's doing these autobiographical paintings. And in this day and age, Frida Kahlo is a rock star. As a matter of fact, um, they did a full length movie on her called Frida, and that was about 20 years ago. But it's Selma Hayek playing Frida, and it's a pretty good film. And anyway, you you know, hey, Akira's back. Alfred Stieglitz. Here's the guy that was bringing all of that European art over here, and he himself was a photographer. And
Goodbye, people. Love
see you, kid.
you. Goodbye.
Um, and so yeah, Stieglitz, he did a lot of things. He was really quite a great photographer. Here is another one of his equivalent. He did a lot of nature photography too. And those of you who've done photography know how difficult it is to do skies and clouds and the sun and all of that stuff. But anyway, he's a great photographer in his own right. But I think he's probably still more known for having uh, brought European art to our shores. Here's another photographer from the 1930s, Edward Weston, and he does. This is kind of like the Georgia O'Keeffe I was telling you about. Nature, in this case, a pepper, close up, filling the space. Of course, this is photo, but if this were in paint and this was in color, it would be a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. And so a lot of these people, there was a lot of interaction between all of these artists. They were kind of a tight group, partly because much of the rest of the country was kind of hostile to their work. But this nature theme, think about Arthur Dove, there you go, and Edward Weston, nude. Again, this close up, see the rib cage, the hips. And so the photo is a nude, but it's actually kind of like an abstract in a sort of a way because we just have part. And so the Center for Creative Photography, University of Arizona in Tucson, and Weston and O'Keefe and a lot of other artists, they moved west. That's where they did their best work. And so I put a star by this one. I told you about mural painters and the WPA. They not only paid painters, they paid photographers to go out and just take pictures. And probably foremost among them is Dorothea Lange and Migrant Mother Nimpomo Valley, California, 1935. And so part of the difference with the photographers were largely out there in the WPA, and they were kind of documenting the hardship that was going on in the Great Depression. And so you can see at Dorothea Lange, there's a lot of photos that kind of spell out the same anxiety, hopelessness, despair that you see with this mother and child, or children, I should say. And so she did a lot of migrant workers, a lot of kind of like following John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, except she did it with a camera. And so this was WPA stuff. And so that's a lot different than having murals painted to kind of depict a political or historical leaning or giving your version, the version you want of the history. And so this is another photographer got to start in the WPA, and this is Fort Peck Dam. And I showed you the Charles Demuth, My Egypt, and this kind of clean, this kind of monumental treatment of industry. Well, you see, in the 1930s, not only was the government paying photographers to go document America, they were also doing things like public works. And so a lot of dams were created at this time to supply electricity, especially to the more remote rural areas. And so, how many of you have seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Nobody? Well, if you've seen the end is about the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they put up this dam, and all of a sudden the water starts filling everything up. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. Uh, they're building dams, and that was in Tennessee, presumably. Um, this is in Montana. We see uh, Hoover Dam. We see Bagnell Dam made the Lake of the Ozarks. All this stuff happened in the 30s. And these photographers we're documenting. And so, anyway, I think along with Charles Demuth, she shares that kind of fascination with all of this industry. But can I add another movie reference here? Margaret Bork White. If you ever see the film Gandhi, at the end of Gandhi's life, there is a woman taking pictures of him for Life magazine. It's just shortly before he gets assassinated, played by a young Candice Bergen, and that is Margaret Bork White. Actually, she worked a lot for Life magazine, which was like one of the premier sources of information in the 1930s. No internet, and stuff like that. And so, anyway, uh, Margaret Bork White did a lot of the photos, the still photos, when the American troops uh, liberated the concentration camps in Europe. And so you see those pictures of people behind barbed wire fences wearing those dirty striped pajamas, emaciated, sick, emaciated, thin, horrible pictures, pictures of the dead bodies. She was it. She documented all of that. Margaret Bork White. And so now we get back to Dada. Dada. And this is a guy who collaborated really with Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp was doing things like taking objects uh, and basically naming them or identifying them or as art. This man Ray would do some similar things. It's called gift, and what he's done is to take a flat iron and glue tacks on the bottom. And flat iron, I got to tell you about this. This is how they would iron clothes. Now, today we don't hardly ever iron clothes because of the technology of fabrics. You fluff dry and its clothes are not wrinkled. Back 100 years ago, most clothes are made of cotton and cotton wrinkles. And if you wanted to wear your clothes, you had to iron them, iron the wrinkles out. And this is before the electric iron. This is a thing that was basically how people iron their clothes. And you put this thing on a stove, probably a wood burning stove or something. You'd put that on there and it'd heat up, and then you'd iron your clothes with this. The reason I'm explaining what it's for is that when you put nails on the bottom, it negates the purpose. It's not functional anymore. And so that's a Dada thing. It's nonsense, it's anti art, it's something that comes to you in your dream. This is in some ways like Merritt Oppenheim's fur covered cup and saucer and spoon. Alexander Calder, you guys probably are aware of him. Artist coming up in the 20s and 30s. And he creates his invention, is what he's really famous for, is this. It's called a mobile. And it's basically the pieces of the sculpture hanging from wires or chains, and it actually moves around. We see mobiles now all over and all the time. Bottom line, on a baby's crib, for example, you see the toys and they move around. It keeps the baby's attention. Well, sculpture 100 years ago wasn't like this. This was something new and totally different, and it challenged the norms. Before this time, sculpture was basically stationary. That is, that it didn't move. And that's why Calder called these mobiles, because in fact, they did move. And so this was a new idea. And remember, I showed you Moreau and automatic drawing? A lot of these shapes were generated by automatic drawing. So they don't really, a lot of times, don't really make a lot of sense. If they end up doing so, good. And we'll talk about lobster trap and fishtail. Bottom line, he's dabbling in surrealism as well. But Calder, again, one of those American artists who had his ear to the ground, had a pipeline to European art, and explored some of the ideas that were being generated by the modernists in Europe. And so, one of the things that really thrives in the United States at the time is architecture. And so, this is where we really kind of knock it out of the park. Architecture, the tallest buildings, I showed you the Wainwright building and stuff from the early part of the, or the late part of the 19th century and the 20th century. We got the tools, we got the manufacturing, we got the engineering, and we have the architects. And we can build buildings that are 100 stories high or more. And this is the Chrysler building, and it was completed in 1930. And interestingly enough, it's just a couple of blocks from the Empire State Building. I think this got on the illustration list because of the architectural kind of decoration that he's put on here. And this is really, this is a, and as well as the Empire State Building, this is like design. This is Art Deco. This is not only tall and magnificent, it's actually artistic as well. It's just not a pile of bricks. It's actually beautiful. And so Frank Lloyd Wright Roby House. Frank Lloyd Wright does a lot of work. He is what they call the prairie style architect, and he makes houses, and there's some in the St. Louis area too. And they're basically low, they're flat, and they're designed for function, to be sure, but also aesthetics. And so you see this is prairie style architecture. And Wright worked in Chicago, but he worked all around the Midwest. There are a lot of Wright buildings in Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois. And so, see, this is kind of interesting thing. It's just a floor plan of the Roby house, but bottom line, it's laid out flat. Unlike houses before that time, which would more or less be stacked up, 1, 2, 3 story house. And so it's laid out flat, prairie style architecture. And this is a house commissioned in Pennsylvania, the Kaufman House, and it's been called Falling Water because it's built over a stream with waterfall, and the architecture actually plays into the landscape. And so we have this prairie style architecture. And again, we have the engineering and we have the technology to create steel that's so strong you can actually build things like this. We have all kinds of materials being invented in the United States. But anyway, this is Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh, darn. I didn't know that was going to be the last. I thought that's the next chapter. We'll see what he does with the Guggenheim Museum. And so, instead of trying to get started on chapter 31, how about this? How about calling it a night? Any questions before you go?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, Brooke. Hey, how do you guys like my granddaughter?
She was very cute, very adorable.
So cute.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, I know. I'm looking for those compliments. Yeah, I think she's the cutest kid I've ever seen. But I'm grandpa, you know. Yeah, and she loves her grandpa, and I'm glad you guys got to meet her.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Robin. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Adios, good luck, and enjoy the beautiful weather.
Thank you, you too.
All right.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.